What if we never truly understood the origin of our own species? What if the fingerprints of an older intelligence, silent, ancient, deliberate, had always been there, hidden beneath stone and myth, erased not by time, but by intent? There are ruins we cannot explain, languages we cannot decode, gaps in our memories so profound they seem designed. And somewhere between Sumerian clay tablets and distant starlight, a name keeps surfacing like a whisper from the abyss: the Anunnaki. Tonight, let your breath slow with the quiet turning of the earth. Let the dark cradle your thoughts. And if you feel the echo of something older than humanity, that is where we begin. This is deformed history, and the story is far from over. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? I love seeing our little map of watches light up around the world. They tell us that history is a line, clear, progressive, unbroken. But have you ever stood before the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and felt something stir beneath the ground? Beneath the silence of the baked brick, there is something that doesn't fit. Not just an absence of data, but the presence of a design. A design too deliberate for coincidence, too complex for the cradle of a new civilization. Sumer, the so-called first. But how does a first civilization emerge suddenly, with astronomy, law, metallurgy, mathematics, and mythologies so structured they rival modern philosophies? How does writing, cuneiform, appeared nearly whole without evidence of gradual evolution? It's as if someone or something pressed start on the simulation and walked away. The Sumerians spoke of gods, but not ethereal, formless beings. No, they described them with startling specificity. Tall, radiant, skilled, commanding beings who came from the sky. The Anunnaki. A name that trembles like static in the dust of old libraries and forbidden texts. Many dismiss these accounts as mere allegory, yet when the gods are described descending from the heavens in flying chariots, when they are said to teach humanity agriculture, architecture, astronomy, are the stories symbolic, or are they memories? The difference is the abyss. Some archaeologists cling tightly to the consensus. They say myth is myth, and all civilization grew from scratch. But there is a thin, trembling line between rationalism and blindness. Because buried among the clay tablets of Nineveh, catalogued by scribes who didn't understand the scope of what they preserved, are fragments of something far older than Sumer. Stories that suggest kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood. Names listed not in centuries, but in epochs. The Sumerian king list is one such relic. It speaks of rulers who lived for 28,800 years, others for 36,000. Scholars call these numbers poetic exaggeration. But what if they aren't? What if they are remnants of a memory system? Something encoded in myth because the truth was too dangerous to preserve plainly. Then there's Eridu, officially recognized as one of the earliest Sumerian cities. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more they find signs of pre-Sumerian layers, architecture, and construction methods that seem incongruent with the supposed technological capacity of that time. temples built on top of older temples, knowledge stacked atop mystery, a structure like a palimpsest of civilization itself. It's easy to dismiss these things when we view history as a ladder, each rung an improvement on the last. But what if it's more like a spiral? What if the ancient past wasn't primitive at all, but something more cyclical, or worse, something interrupted? We know the Earth has faced cataclysms, floods, magnetic reversals, impacts, entire coastlines lost to rising seas. Could it be that the stories of a global flood, found in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, in India, in Mesoamerica, are not metaphors but memories of a civilizational reset, a controlled reboot? And if there was a reset, who pressed the button? The Anunnaki are often linked with the Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible, giants, offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. In some interpretations, these are the same beings. But the Bible hides its secrets in plain sight, doesn't it? In Genesis 6:4, we read of the Nephilim existing in those days and also afterward. How does myth explain their survival across the flood? How does history pretend they never existed? There are depictions of the Anunnaki holding pine cones and mysterious objects, watches, devices, at Assyrian sites. Their wings stretch wide, not like birds, but like echoes of a forgotten aeronautical knowledge. Again and again, they are shown manipulating something in their left hand, always the left. What were they tending? DNA? Time? A fusion of the two? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known literary texts, we read of a king in search of immortality. He travels to meet Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah. But it's not the flood story itself that unsettles. It's the presence of divine beings guiding it. It's the idea that they chose who lived, who was worthy of surviving the great cleansing. Why would gods meddle in the affairs of Earth? Why would celestial entities create, destroy, and curate humanity like a lab experiment? The late Zecharia Sitchin suggested a radical hypothesis that the Anunnaki came from a distant planet, Nibiru, and genetically modified Homo erectus to create Homo sapiens as a labor force. His interpretations, drawn from decades of studying ancient Sumerian texts, were widely criticized but never entirely disproven.
Mainstream science demands repeatable evidence, but history, true history, is rarely repeatable. Sometimes all that's left is a whisper in the sand, a pattern etched in stone, or a myth that refuses to die. Why is it that every ancient civilization speaks of gods descending from the sky? The Mayans, the Egyptians, the Dogon, the Hopi, each with stories of celestial teachers who came in fire and thunder, or silence and light. The parallels are uncanny, almost rehearsed, as if they're different translations of the same original text scattered across continents by time, erosion, and forgetfulness. But what if it wasn't forgetfulness? What if it was design? And who exactly benefits from forgetting? You look at a crumbling ziggurat and see decay. Weathered bricks, collapsed altars, dust clinging to centuries of silence. But somewhere in that silence, something pulses. A logic, a message carved not in language, but in structure, symmetry, alignment. As if these temples were not places of worship, but machines, not built for gods, but by them. Why does Eridu, the city of Enki, sit at the intersection of myth and magnetism? Satellite scans have revealed anomalies beneath its foundation, patterns too regular for nature, too ancient for explanation. Circular depressions, linear channels, subsurface walls older than the visible ruins. Some archaeologists dismiss them as geological quirks, but others don't speak at all. They lose grants, they lose tenure, they learn what happens to those who dig too deep. It is easy to laugh at the idea of ancient astronauts. Easier still to mock the ones who dare ask if history is more than we were told. But what if laughter is the lock on the vault? What if ridicule is the tool used not to protect us from lies, but to guard the truth? There is something deeply strategic in how ancient knowledge vanishes. Not all at once, not by chance, like stars going out in a planned sequence. The Library of Alexandria burns. The Temple of Enki is buried. Mayan codices are incinerated by missionaries. Inquisition silences heretics. The pattern is always the same. Memory is erased under the guise of salvation. Myth becomes madness. Inquiry becomes sin. The Anunnaki myths didn't just vanish. They were replaced, rewritten, filtered through successive empires who reshaped them into palatable religion or harmless fable. Enlil becomes El. Inanna becomes Ishtar, then Aphrodite. Their names soften, their purpose distorts, but fragments remain, enough to whisper. And yet those fragments are dangerous. In 1976, when Sitchin published The 12th Planet, his interpretation of Sumerian texts triggered outrage. He wasn't the first to suggest a lost chapter in human origins, but he was among the first to do so with linguistic research and citations from primary tablets. The response wasn't a debate, it was dismissal, the scholarly equivalent of closing the door and turning off the light. But the public listened. The idea that humans were engineered, not evolved, that our creators walked among us and then departed, it awakened something primal, an itch behind the eyes, a memory we're not supposed to have. Is it so unthinkable? After all, modern science has already decoded and edited genomes.
We splice genes. We alter embryos. We create synthetic life. What would ancient humans, watching a luminous being descend from the sky and manipulate matter, call such a figure? They would call them gods. And the gods would need labor. Ancient Sumerian tablets speak of the Anunnaki, lesser gods who rebelled against their labor conditions, prompting the Anunnaki to create humans, not out of love, not for companionship, but necessity. That word echoes, doesn't it? Necessity. If these texts are metaphor, they are terrifying metaphors. If they are literal, they change everything. What else has been hidden? In the ruins of Gobekli Tepe, buried deliberately around 9600 BCE, long before Sumer, there are T-shaped megaliths carved with vultures, scorpions, lions, and enigmatic figures. No writing, no houses, just symbolism and precision. Carbon dating confirms its age, its purpose, unknown. But its builders were not hunter-gatherers. Not in any way we understand. It is as if someone planted the seeds of civilization in layers, waiting for them to bloom. And Gobekli Tepe is just the beginning. Under the ice of Antarctica, satellite images have revealed geometric anomalies. NASA doesn't speak of them. Military flights over the region are restricted. Speculative? Perhaps. But can we keep dismissing questions? Time and again, the patterns repeat. A discovery is made. Data leaks. Interest rises. Then silence. Either from ridicule or retraction or something more permanent. But the truth doesn't vanish. It mutates. It becomes myth. And in myth, it waits. Look closer at the timelines. The rise of Sumer around 4000 BCE. The flood myths dating back to 10,000 BCE. The sudden, inexplicable appearances of stonework and celestial alignment in civilizations across the globe. No transitional evidence, no slow progress, just emergence. Is this evolution or inheritance? If the Anunnaki left, if they ever truly came, what did they leave behind? And more importantly, who kept their secrets? Because someone did. The Vatican Library holds hundreds of thousands of volumes, many of which are restricted, untranslated, sealed by decree. Why? What truth requires such protection? There is a tablet known as the Enuma Elish, which tells of Tiamat, chaos incarnate, and Marduk, who slays her to form the world. To the untrained eye, it's myth. To the symbolic reader, it's the record of cosmic restructuring, a cosmic war, one planet destroyed, another born. Sitchin interpreted this as retelling of planetary collisions, a cosmic event that shaped our solar system. Mainstream astronomers now speculate about Planet 9, a hidden celestial body with an elongated orbit affecting the Kuiper Belt. They are looking for what the ancients may have already known. And yet these ideas remain on the fringe. Not because they lack logic, but because they lack permission. Who grants that permission? Who decides what history is, and why does it feel curated? They say memory fades with time, but what if time isn't the real thief? What if something or someone erased the memory of our origins with purpose, leaving behind just enough to ignite curiosity, but not enough to form a coherent truth? The Sumerians never claimed to invent their knowledge. They insisted it was given. The Anunnaki, descending from the heavens, brought laws, architecture, healing, mathematics, and star charts so precise they still astonish. But there is no pre-Sumerian documentation of gradual development. No tools, no failed drafts, no evidence of experimentation. Only arrival, sudden, complete. Is that how knowledge is born? In 2003, researchers completed the Human Genome Project And what they found, what they didn't say loudly, was more intriguing than what they did. Embedded in our DNA are node-coding regions, often dismissed as junk. But among this so-called junk are sequences that seem to act like software patches, insertions with no clear evolutionary trail. A group of Russian geneticists proposed that this portion of DNA may function like a biological language, structured, intelligent, something that doesn't evolve by accident, but by design. Their findings never made headlines, but they exist. Published, peer-reviewed, quietly shelved.
Why quietly? In the Book of Enoch, a text removed from canonical scripture, we read of the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth, taught forbidden knowledge, and corrupted humanity. They taught metallurgy, enchantments, the signs of the stars, and for this they were punished, cast into shadow. But their offspring, the Nephilim, remained. The parallels to the Anunnaki are more than poetic. They are precise, beings from the sky, interbreeding, genetic manipulation, punishment, a celestial tribunal. And yet, the Book of Enoch is branded apocryphal. Why would such a detailed, consistent narrative be discarded unless its clarity was a threat? There are genetic anomalies in the human species that remain unexplained. A sudden doubling of brain size approximately 200,000 years ago. A speech gene, FOXP2, that seems to have mutated suddenly, allowing complex language. And blood types, particularly Rh negative. Roughly 15% of the global population has Rh negative blood, a type incompatible with Rh positive pregnancies. It's a trait that offers no clear evolutionary advantage and yet persists. Some researchers, quietly, have suggested it might originate from a distinct lineage, a non-terrestrial one. But we are not allowed to say that out loud. And still, the stories persist. The Dogon people of Mali tell of Nomo, amphibious beings who came from the star Sirius. Their oral traditions, untouched by modern astronomy, contain detailed knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star companion, invisible to the naked eye and only confirmed by telescopes in the 20th century. They knew its density, its orbit, its relationship to Sirius A. How? Coincidence or memory? The same memory that echoes in the pyramid texts of Egypt, in which the pharaoh is described as ascending to the stars to join the gods from whom he descended. The same memory encoded in Vedic texts, where flying ships, vimanas, traverse the skies with the power of sound and fire. The same memory whispered in Aboriginal dream time, where beings from the stars shaped the earth and seeded life. Too many cultures, too many patterns, too much symmetry, and yet still no consensus. Mainstream archaeology resists these questions. It demands stone tools, potsherds, and bone fragments as proof. But proof in their language means what fits the existing model. Anything else is dismissed as pseudo-history, fringe, dangerous. But is truth always found in the center? Look at the Nazca lines of Peru. Enormous geoglyphs carved into the desert floor, spanning hundreds of meters, depicting animals, spirals, humanoid forms. They can only be properly viewed from above. Were they art, ritual, or signals to something overhead?
Eric von Däken, though often sensationalized, asked one essential question: why do so many ancient structures align with celestial bodies? Not roughly, not approximately, but with impossible precision. Pyramids that align to Orion's belt, stone circles that track solstices, temples that echo the stars in their layouts. It is as if ancient Earth was a canvas and the sky was the blueprint. But blueprints imply builders, and if the builders left, where did they go? Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki would return, that their elongated orbit around our sun, if Nibiru exists, would bring them back after millennia. But perhaps their return is not physical. Perhaps it is formational, symbolic, a reawakening of memory. Because even now the symbols remain. The pine cone in Sumerian reliefs, once thought to represent the tree of life, also appears in Vatican iconography. A massive pine cone sculpture sits in the courtyard of the Pina, flanked by bronze peacocks and nested within esoteric geometry. Why? What does the Church know of Sumerian symbolism? Or is it that ancient knowledge was never lost, just hidden? Modern tech giants name their programs Genesis, Prometheus, Apollo, Gaia, myth repackaged in code, AI trained on human language, neural nets mimicking human thought. Are we repeating something we once inherited? Are we unknowingly recreating what the Anunnaki once did, building life from code? And if so, are we the creators or the created? Repeating a cycle. There's a line in the ancient text of the Atrahasis: "Let them bear the yoke. Let man bear the load of the gods." A strange phrase if man was made in divine image, but fitting if man was made for divine labor. Perhaps that's why there's always been unrest, a primal itch that no religion, no science, no empire can satisfy. We seek the gods, not to worship, but to remember. Because something in us remembers, not with clarity, but with ache. There's something disquieting about a statue whose eyes still seem to watch. The alabaster pupils of Sumerian idols, wide, unblinking, stare, not in devotion, but expectation. As if they were built to record, or to remember, or perhaps to be remembered. These idols aren't crude. They're deliberate, measured, often holding objects. Scholars still debate vessels, scrolls, devices. And behind them, always behind them, are the inscriptions, etchings that speak of order from chaos, of divine instruction, of beings who descended to earth in a time before time. One phrase appears again and again: me. Not as in me, as in self, but the Sumerian me, divine decrees, laws of civilization. They weren't discovered. The tablets say they were delivered by Enki from the heavens. Tangible knowledge passed down like programs from a server, a transfer of protocol. And the temples weren't just altars. They were hubs, places of learning, of coordination, places where the me were housed, stored, tended. But what kind of society treats knowledge as artifact? What kind of civilization inherits wisdom like relics? Something doesn't add up, because the narrative of slow human advancement cannot account for the compression of breakthroughs during that narrow Sumerian window. Cities, astronomy, complex mathematics, irrigation, metallurgy, timekeeping, all appearing in less than a millennium. Not as scattered ideas, but integrated systems. There's a pattern here, an eerie familiarity, as if Sumer wasn't an origin, but a reboot. And if Sumer was a reboot,
What came before? To ask that is to step into a fog, a place where history dissolves and memory begins to ache. But traces remain, scars on the earth, murmurs in old texts, flood myths in over 200 cultures, stories of a time before wiped clean by water or fire or silence. Plato's Themis speaks of Atlantis, a civilization destroyed not by failure, but by hubris. He attributes the tale to Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests. They spoke of a time when great knowledge was lost, and not for the first time. You Greeks are like children, no old men who remember. Because the earth, they explained, is periodically cleansed. But by what hand? And for what reason? Could it be that the Anunnaki themselves initiated the reset? The Atrahasis epic, older than Genesis, describes a world overrun by humans, noisy, chaotic, multiplying without restraint. Enlil, displeased, sends droughts, famine, plagues, and finally, the flood. Only with Enki's quiet rebellion is humanity saved through a chosen man warned to build a vessel. Sound familiar? And it begs the question, what if Earth was never meant to be ours? What if we were a byproduct of something else? A utility species designed for service, granted knowledge when it suited them and silenced when it didn't. There's a theory quietly passed among fringe physicists and cosmologists that information is never lost, not truly, that even black holes long thought to erase data might merely encode it beyond our comprehension. So what happens when knowledge is deleted not by entropy but by design? You get a species like us, with myths instead of memories, with echoes instead of records. But even echoes leave patterns. The flood myths always include the same details: a warning, a boat, a mountain, a chosen few, survival, continuity. Why does that structure persist across Sumer, Babylon, India, Mesoamerica, and the Pacific Islands? How do cultures with no known contact share the same archetype? Maybe because they're not stories. Maybe because they're backups. A preserved thread passed through generations, through language and ritual and dream. A way to remember the last time the gods reset the system. And now, standing at the edge of our own technological singularity, we begin to mirror those same gods.
We edit genomes. We build artificial minds. We seed machines with the blueprints of life, but we do it without knowing where we come from, without context, like children playing with fire in a house built of straw and old secrets. And sometimes the house remembers. Look at the ruins beneath the ocean. In the waters of Yonani, Japan, lie angular stone formations, steps, terraces, walls that suggest architecture. The official explanation? Natural formations. But geologists like Masaki Kimura argue otherwise. They say tool marks exist, that the formations are aligned with cardinal directions, that they could be over 10,000 years old. If so, that places them before the last ice age, before Sumer, before the version of history we've been given. Are they remnants of the world before the reset? What else beneath the seas? In India's Gulf of Combat, sonar scans revealed a submerged city. Grids of stone, streets, and artifacts dating back nearly 9,000 years. The discovery was quietly shelved, labeled inconclusive. But the divers who retrieved the samples, they didn't forget. One of them said, "It was like finding a memory that wasn't yours." That phrase lingers because memory, like ruins, doesn't need to be complete to be real. In Sumerian art, the gods often stand on strange platforms, not thrones, not altars, but devices, machines, sometimes winged, sometimes adorned with tubing or glyphs that resemble circuit diagrams, always hovering, always above, and always separate from mankind. They reach down not to bless, but to instruct, to command. Their eyes never soften, their bodies never age, their roles never change. Eternal administrators, not creators, but engineers. The Anunnaki may not have made Earth, but they certainly reorganized it. And if their systems once governed this world, if they built the first cities as nodes in a network, if they encoded memory in ritual and stone, what happens when we stumble into those systems again? Are we reactivating something ancient or inviting something back? There is something haunting about a city designed for the sky. Eridu, they say, was the first, not the first settlement, but the first point in a grid, set not by accident, but alignment. The ziggurat at its center was not merely a temple, not simply a shrine to Enki. It was built in tiers, levels, layers, a rising pyramid of stone, echoing something beyond human architecture, echoing memory. Each level ascended like a step toward the divine, but perhaps it wasn't heaven the architects were reaching for. Perhaps it was signal, a frequency, a place where energy and intention met. Ancient texts describe the Absu beneath Enki's temple, a deep, watery domain beneath the earth. Modern scholars translate it as myth, but Sumerians never spoke in fables. Their stories are operational, schematics masquerading as narrative. Absu may not have been metaphor, it may have been a power source, a literal reservoir of energy, physical or otherwise, that the temple was designed to interface with. If that's true, then the ziggurat was not just a spiritual monument, it was a machine. Consider the layout of ancient Sumerian cities. Radio, concentric roads, designed not for expansion, but symmetry. Centers anchored by ziggurats, surrounded by administrative buildings, walls and rivers carefully diverted. Why would early civilization prioritize order over survival? Why was geometry sacred? Because it wasn't about survival, it was about preservation. Something was being encoded into the very shape of these cities, a resonance, a language of stone. And that language is everywhere. In Egypt, Osiris at Abydos is sunken, megalithic, and unlike any other temple structure, its granite blocks are so massive that even modern cranes would struggle to move them. Mainstream archaeology cannot explain why a culture supposedly working with copper chisels would construct something with such precision, buried beneath ground level, built in water, and yet the temple above it, more modern, more ornate, sits on top like an afterthought, as if someone discovered the old and built over it, as if someone found the core memory and tried to overwrite it. This pattern repeats. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman show stones fitted so tightly that not even a blade of grass can pass between them. But above the megaliths are smaller stones, less refined, clearly added later. The builders changed, the methods declined, but the foundation endured. Who built the first layer? And what were they trying to stabilize? We think of temples as sacred, but sacred is just another word for forbidden places we're not meant to question. Yet in every major civilization, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indus Valley, Mesoamerican, temples were the axis, the hub, the one structure always aligned with stars. Why? Because they weren't simply for worship, they were tools. In the Vedic texts, temples are described as energy centers, vortices where Earth's powers harnessed, redirected. Rituals were not prayers, they were activations. Chants were frequencies. Geometry was code. Modern science dismisses these ideas. But what is sound if not vibration? And what is vibration if not energy arranged with intent? The Anunnaki, as described in Mesopotamian tablets, were not whimsical deities. They were engineers, biologists, judges. Each had function. Each played a role. Enki, the master geneticist, Enlil, the commander of authority, Ninhursag, the mother of life. Not gods in the religious sense, but specialists, operatives in a larger mission. And the temples were their command posts. We've uncovered hundreds of cuneiform tablets detailing rituals, measurements, and procedures written not as poetry, but administration. Records of offerings, procedures, warnings. They read more like spreadsheets than scripture, because the divine order was a bureaucracy, and humans were the workforce. The deeper we dig, the clearer the hierarchy becomes. Humans were assigned tasks, trained, monitored, rewarded or punished based on compliance. In the Code of Uranamu, the oldest known legal code, justice is meted out not by divine will, but by institutional mandate. The gods issue laws, humans enforce them. It's as if the entire civilization was a controlled simulation, a sandbox, a prototype. And then something happened. The records begin to shift. The gods grow distant. Communication falters. Temples fall into disuse. Statues lose detail. Myths become more fragmented. Like a program slowly losing bandwidth. Like a system that no longer receives updates. What caused the connection to break? A natural disaster? A cosmic alignment? Or perhaps the mission simply ended. The operators left, and what remained was a forgotten interface, humming quietly through stone and silence, waiting. Some researchers believe these ancient sites were part of a global network. Ley lines, magnetic corridors, places where Earth's natural energy converges. The Anunnaki didn't build at random. They tapped into something, anchored their presence through these nodes. And we, unaware, have continued to build on these same lines. Washington, D.C., the Vatican, the Great Pyramid, CERN, all situated on points of power. Is this coincidence, or memory playing itself out through design? The temples of the Anunnaki were not merely relics of the past. They may be dormant components of a larger system, one we no longer understand but still inhabit. And if that system begins to reactivate, will we recognize the signal or mistake it for madness? Beneath every city, every ruin, every carefully stacked stone, there is a deeper silence. It isn't just geological, it's mnemonic. The earth holds memory, and sometimes it murmurs, not in words, but in pulses, frequencies, tremors that don't come from tectonic plates, but from something older, something encoded. There are legends in the Middle East of underground chambers beneath the ancient ziggurats. Not crypts, not tombs, but rooms without doors. Cavities of polished black stone where the air feels charged, heavy with presence. Some early explorers described humming beneath their feet. Others grew sick, disoriented. Reports were buried, funding pulled, maps redacted. But still, the rumors linger, and the question remains: what lies beneath? The Sumerians believed the gods came from the heavens, but they also spoke of the underworld, not a place of punishment, but of storage, knowledge, control. The Absu, again the deep place, sometimes depicted as water, sometimes as vault, a realm not ruled by demons, but by laws, conditions, mechanisms. Could it be that the surface temples were only terminals, that the true architecture of the gods was subterranean, hidden beneath sand and stone and time? In Cappadocia, Turkey, the city of Derinkuyu extends over 18 levels deep, carved with precision, capable of housing tens of thousands, complete with ventilation shafts, wells, storage rooms, a full society beneath the surface, and no one knows who built it or why. Mainstream theory attributes it to early Christians fleeing persecution, but that doesn't explain the scale, the engineering, or the fact that it predates Christianity by millennia. Who digs an entire city underground unless they are hiding from something above or following a design from something below? Then there is the phenomenon of acoustic resonance in ancient sites. In Malta's Hypogeum, a subterranean temple over 5,000 years old, certain chambers produce specific frequencies when sound is emitted, a 110 Hz resonance that affects the brain's limbic system. Visitors describe hallucinations, dizziness, visions. The builders could not have known about acoustic engineering in the modern sense, or could they? Because similar acoustic properties are found in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, in Newgrange, Ireland, in Chavin de Huantar, Peru. Distant sites, disparate cultures, yet the same frequencies, the same knowledge. Was this technology, ritual, or both? If vibration affects matter, and if sound can encode information, what were these chambers built to transmit or receive? There's a growing field called archaeoacoustics. It explores the sound properties of ancient architecture. What it's finding is both thrilling and unsettling. Many ancient sites are not just visually aligned with stars, but sonically tuned to the earth, to natural resonances, Schumann frequencies, magnetic pulses, low rumbles that travel through stone like signals. Who was listening? And more importantly, who was speaking? The ancients did not separate science from spirit. To them, energy was divine, numbers were sacred, geometry was scripture, and beneath it all ran a conviction that knowledge is not invented, but accessed. Plato wrote of anamnesis, a theory that all learning is remembering, that the soul, having lived many times, already knows all things and merely awakens them. The Sumerians might have agreed. They described the Tablet of Destinies, a device held by the gods controlling fate, time, and power. Was it myth or a metaphor? For access to systems, to codes, to memory banks embedded in the earth itself. There are stories, too, often dismissed, of beings emerging from underground. The Hopi speak of the ant people who sheltered them during the Great Fire above. The Apache speak of emergence from a hollow earth. The Mayans say their ancestors came from caves, and in Sumer, the gods came not just from the sky, but from the deep. Why both? Unless the divide between above and below is artificial, unless we're looking in the wrong direction. Modern physics is beginning to admit what mystics always claimed, that space and time are not fixed, that information is the fundamental building block of reality, not matter, not energy, but encoded, retrievable data. So what if the Earth isn't just a planet? What if it's also a hard drive, and ancient sites are access points? If the Anunnaki were architects, not of life, but of systems, civilizations as protocols, temples as nodes, then perhaps what remains is not just ruins, but fragments of an operating system buried beneath us, waiting to be rebooted. And perhaps the reboot has already begun, because in recent years we'd begun tunneling, digging deeper, drilling into the Earth's crust for data, for minerals, for access. Projects like CERN, like DUMS, deep underground military bases whose scope and purpose are always classified, like the Svalbard Seed Vault, storing genetic code on a glacier in the event of disaster. Why such urgency to protect genetic information? Why such secrecy around subterranean construction? What are we preparing for? Or rediscovering? The Sumerians spoke of the return of the gods, not as judgment, but as reconnection, restoration of the order lost in the Great Flood. What if that's what's really approaching? Not a ship in the sky, but a reactivation beneath the earth. A pulse, a frequency, a memory?
And when it comes, will we recognize it? Or will we call it something else, an anomaly, a glitch, a dream? Sometimes it's not what we hear that speaks the loudest. It's what doesn't come. The silence, the waiting, the absence where there should be sound. And above us, beyond the haze of the atmosphere and the weight of gravity, there is a vast silence that pulses with secrets we were never meant to understand. The stars are still there, watching. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki were said to come from a celestial place called Nibiru, translated by some as Planet of the Crossing. Sitchin controversially argued this referred to a real planet with an elliptical orbit so long that it returns to the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. Astronomers scoffed. There was no such body, no record of a wandering world. But then something strange began to happen. In 2016, scientists at Caltech presented indirect evidence of a massive, unseen planet far beyond Pluto. They didn't call it Nibiru. They called it Planet 9, an object up to 10 times Earth's mass, influencing the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects, pulling comets and space debris into patterns they shouldn't follow. They can't see it, not yet, but it's there. And its orbit, long, slow, and mysterious, echoes the very timeline described in the ancient tablets. Coincidence, or a whisper from a deeper memory? The Anunnaki myths never claimed these beings were divine in the way we think of gods. They were powerful, advanced, but fallible. They fought among themselves. They disagreed. Some protected humanity, others wanted us erased. And their cycles of intervention always aligned with something. The sky, the return of the gods, the resetting of the earth, the rise and fall of civilizations, all synchronized with celestial mechanics. Ancient people watched the heavens obsessively, not just for beauty, for survival. They encoded stellar alignments into temples, pyramids, even cave art. The sky was the first clock, the first calendar, and perhaps the first warning system, because when the stars moved in certain ways, history changed. There is evidence, disputed but persistent, of global cataclysms occurring in rhythmic intervals. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet, or fragments thereof, struck the Earth around 12 and 800 years ago, triggering massive flooding, wildfires, and a sudden return to glacial conditions. This coincides eerily with the end of the last ice age and with the legends of the Great Flood across cultures. Some believe the comet impact came from the torrid meteostream, a debris field that Earth passes through twice a year. Others suggest it was nudged inward by a massive outer planet, something like Planet 9. If that's true, then Nibiru, or whatever name we dare use, isn't just a home to ancient beings. It's a trigger, and maybe a clock. The Sumerians weren't alone in their obsession with stellar cycles. The Mayans tracked the motion of Venus with stunning accuracy. The Dogon people knew of Sirius B. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids to Orion. All over the world, ancient builders pointed their structures to the stars, as if waiting for something, or remembering something they once saw. But what did they see? In 1561, over Nuremberg, dozens of witnesses described a strange battle in the sky, objects shaped like cylinders and spheres, clashing, emitting smoke before vanishing. In 1566, a similar event was reported in Basel. Newspapers of the time called them omens, divine signs. But what if they were something else? A memory resurfacing, a test, or the remnants of a recurring surveillance. History is filled with accounts like these, anomalous aerial phenomena drawn in medieval manuscripts, etched into cave walls, carved into stone. Even in Sumerian tablets, the gods descend in what some describe as skyboats, whirling discs, or heavenly chariots. Are these poetic metaphors, or the earliest documentation of craft? Our modern world is increasingly obsessed with the skies. Governments declassify reports. Pilots come forward. Objects move without propulsion, blink in and out of radar. The silence is breaking. But slowly, carefully, as if something is being managed. And that word returns again, managed. What if the greatest cover-up in human history isn't just about contact, but timing? That the Earth is watched on a schedule, that civilization is allowed to rise, to reach certain thresholds, and then reset. Not always by destruction, sometimes by distraction, sometimes by rewriting memory, and always in alignment with celestial events. There is a concept in ancient astrology called the Great Year, a 26,000-year cycle of the equinoxes caused by the wobble of Earth's axis. Many ancient cultures seem to know about this, though mainstream science claims it wasn't discovered until Hipparchus in 130 BCE. But how could the ancients encode something so vast, so slow, into their temples and myths? Unless they were told, unless someone gave them the key. The Anunnaki in Sumerian texts were obsessed with order, with maintaining control over me, the decrees of civilization. They watched human progress closely, and when the noise became too great, when humanity forgot its place, they intervened.
What if that's the cycle we're in now? AI, genetic engineering, nuclear capability, global networks. We are reaching thresholds of godlike power, and yet we have no origin myth that grounds us, no memory that warns us, no understanding of what happened the last time we reached this point. Unless that memory is the silence itself. Unless we are the product of a restart, and the countdown has already begun. There's something ghostly about clay. It holds fingerprints long after flesh has disappeared. It captures intention, mistake, even silence. And in the brittle clay tablets of Mesopotamia, thousands of them cracked and broken in museum drawers, there are sentences that should not exist. Sentences that do not belong to the world we've been told is real. Lines describing not superstition, but mathematics, celestial mechanics, planetary periods more precise than the tools archaeologists say the Sumerians had. Entire epics recounting floods, genetic lineages, arguments between powerful beings over how to govern Earth. Fragments of memory pressed into clay like backup files after a system crash. We've been taught that history flows cleanly, that civilization progresses upward, but those tablets speak of something else, of eras before the era, of ages before kings, of beings before man, and someone wanted us to forget. The burning of the Library of Alexandria wasn't the only loss. In Nineveh, the Library of Ashurbanipal once held over 30,000 clay tablets, meticulously catalogued. Myth, law, medicine, astronomy. But it too fell to fire and time. What remains are fragments, half-translated, scattered. Among them, a chilling tablet known as the Kalkul tablet lists the names of Anunnaki assigned to various gates, to the heavens, to the underworld. A roster, a chain of command, not a myth-making, but an operational chart. Why would a myth require an administrative hierarchy? Unless it wasn't a myth, unless it was a history, flattened, sanitized, and disguised. The Sumerians themselves never claimed originality. Their texts say their knowledge was handed down, that their first cities were given form by gods, that kingship descended from heaven, not invented, delivered. That phrase repeats in the king lists and epics like a forgotten line of code. And the kings, the earliest rulers, reigned for thousands of years, tens of thousands. Mainstream historians call it exaggeration, but those same historians accept reigns of Egyptian gods and demigods before the pharaohs spanning millennia. The Hindu yugas describe cycles of humanity lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Are all these timelines mistakes, or are we missing the scale? Modern science is built on observation, replication, data. But data itself can be curated, removed, adjusted. And if knowledge is erased at the roots, the tree never grows. Who controls the roots? Consider the Vatican's secret archives, hundreds of thousands of documents hidden from public view, some dating back over 1,000 years. Access requires approval, rank, trust.
What secrets are too dangerous to reveal? Ancient texts, untranslated tablets, knowledge incompatible with doctrine. Then there are the missing years. The phantom time hypothesis suggests that nearly 300 years of history between 614 and 911 CE were fabricated, that the calendar was adjusted, that historical records were rewritten to align with religious or imperial needs. Mainstream historians scoff. But calendar reforms did happen. Dates were lost, others inserted. Time itself was edited. If we can't trust the continuity of the last 2 millennia, how can we trust anything deeper? The timeline of humanity is held together by a few carbon dates, a handful of artifacts, and a consensus that shifts with every discovery. But what if that consensus was set to ensure a certain narrative, to erase what came before the flood, not just the flood of water, but the flood of forgetting? Sitchin once wrote that Earth is not the cradle of civilization, but the laboratory, a test bed. And every test has a protocol, every subject a limit. Perhaps that's why the Anunnaki departed, or appeared to. Not because their mission ended, but because the experiment needed space to run. And the best way to run a test is to remove all memory of its beginning. This is why the temples were repurposed, why the gods were given new names, why the tablets were scattered, burned, sealed. It wasn't conquest, it was curation, a pruning of collective memory so clean that it became architecture. So deep that we now worship the scaffolding and forget the structure. But pieces remain, hidden in plain sight. In Hindu myth, the god Vishnu descends in different forms across cosmic cycles, avatars tailored to each age. One of them, Kalki, is yet to come, a being who returns to reset the world at the end of Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and forgetting. In ancient Egypt, Thoth was the keeper of all knowledge. In some texts, he stores the secrets of creation in the Hall of Records, a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx. Mainstream archaeology denies its existence, but ground-penetrating radar in the 1990s revealed anomalies, rectilinear cavities under the Sphinx's paw. Investigations were halted. The chamber remains sealed.
Why? Because we are not supposed to remember. Because remembering is dangerous. Because to remember is to become unpredictable. The Anunnaki in the tablets feared human unpredictability. When given too much freedom, too much knowledge, we grew noisy, ambitious, rebellious. The flood wasn't punishment. It was a reset, not out of malice, but control, to ensure the program stayed on track. And perhaps it still is. Look around. The age of digital memory is upon us. Data is collected, curated, purged. AI learns us, predicts us. We train systems to think, but we've forgotten the first systems, those built not by silicon, but by stone and blood and ritual. We create without asking where creation began. We speak of progress, but what if progress is the trap? What if forgetting was always part of the design? What if we're not evolving, but rebooting? It always begins with a burial, a bone, a fragment, a tool, a tooth, something dug up from silence and held to the light, only for someone to whisper, anomaly. Because for every artifact that confirms the consensus, there are others that don't. outliers, finds that shouldn't exist because they don't fit the model. And so they vanish, stored in vaults, dismissed as contamination, labeled out of context. The bones that challenge the timeline are the ones we rarely hear about. Take the case of the Nampa figurine, discovered in Idaho in 1889, a tiny, skillfully crafted human figure found in a well boring over 300 feet deep beneath strata dated to over 2 million years ago. Impossible, they said, couldn't be. And so it was dismissed. But it remains real, undeniable. An echo that no longer exists. Or the footprints in Laetoli, Tanzania, 3.6 million years old. Perfectly human, not ape-like, human. But no one knows how they got there. They predate Homo sapiens by over 3 million years. The conclusion? An early hominin with a strange human-like gait. Another workaround. And what of the Dropa stones, alleged disc-shaped objects found in the mountains of China, said to contain microscopic inscriptions describing star travelers who crash-landed on Earth thousands of years ago? Officially debunked. Yet the story lingers, a strange echo. These stories matter not because they prove, but because they refuse to disappear. They linger in the corners of anthropology like shadows no one wants to name. There is a silence surrounding origins, a discomfort. It's as if we're allowed to study evolution only within pre-approved corridors. As long as the conclusions point to randomness, chaos, mutation, the path is clear. But if the evidence begins to resemble intention, the path narrows, and when it leads to blood, it vanishes. Consider the mitochondrial Eve, the woman from whom all modern humans inherit their mitochondrial DNA, traced back to roughly 150,000 years ago in Africa. This supports the out-of-Africa theory, a cornerstone of modern anthropology. But then came the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, and the realization that modern humans carry fragments of these other species. Admixture, interbreeding, hybridization. And then something else. There are genes in the human genome that don't match any known archaic lineage, segments that appear abruptly with no evolutionary precedent. Ghost lineages, some call them. Traces of encounters with beings who were no longer here, or perhaps who were never from here to begin with. If the Anunnaki, as some claim, engineered Homo sapiens from earlier hominins, then these genomic anomalies aren't mysteries. They're signatures, insertion points, code. And when we look at ancient texts with new eyes, the genetic language becomes clearer. In the Epic of Atrahasis, humanity is created by mixing the blood of a god with clay. Life is crafted by the hands of Ninhursag, the goddess of birth. Enki oversees the process. They speak of vessels, molds, failures, prototypes. It sounds less like a myth and more like a lab report. And the result? A hybrid. Not entirely divine, not fully beast, something in between. Us. But hybrids are unstable, and history has always feared the instability of the in-between. Look at the bloodlines of royalty. From Sumer to Egypt to Europe,
Divine right is always traced through blood, an unbroken chain. Why? Why does power obsess over purity? Because someone remembered. Because someone knew that certain lines carried something others didn't. A fragment, a key, a dormant code. And so began the quiet culling. Not overt genocide, not always, but selective breeding, intermarriage, control through genealogy. Temples became courts. Priests became kings. Knowledge was hoarded, passed down through veins, not books. Even today, the elite trace their ancestry, preserve their lines, not out of vanity, but out of memory. Memory they don't speak of. Memory encoded in their blood. And still some slipped through. There are people who dream of places they've never been, who remember languages they've never learned, who hear tones beneath silence, who know things they shouldn't know. They are called sensitive, strange, disordered. But perhaps they are fragments, glitches in the amnesia. The ancient Gnostics believed that humanity was trapped in a false reality crafted by a lesser god, the demiurge, who wanted to keep us ignorant. Only by awakening the divine spark within could we escape. That spark, they said, was a memory, and memory is dangerous. The Anunnaki, as depicted in later Babylonian myth, grew increasingly wary of humans. We multiplied, we questioned, we defied. And so measures were taken, lifespans shortened, languages divided, histories lost. Each act, a compression of memory, a downgrade. It was not enough to enslave us. We had to forget who we were. And yet, the blood remembers. Across the globe, ancient tribes describe star ancestors, beings who came from above, not spirits, not metaphors, ancestors. The Zulu speak of the Nomo, the Navajo of the Star People, the Australian Aboriginals of the Wandjina, and always the same themes: instruction, descent, memory. Could these stories be remnants of real encounters? Could blood carry not just biology, but history? Some scientists now believe that memory can be epigenetic, encoded not just in neurons, but in the very structure of our DNA. Trauma, knowledge, experience, passed down chemically, biologically.
Memory, not as metaphor, but as inheritance. So what happens when the memory begins to wake? When ancient code, long dormant, begins to stir? When bones and blood and breath begin to echo names we were told were only myth? Perhaps that is why there is such urgency now to distract, to divide, to rewrite, because something ancient is stirring, and not all memories go quietly. Some things aren't lost because they disappeared. They're lost because we stopped knowing how to look. Scattered across the earth are stones that speak, but not in words, in hums, in pulses, in harmonics older than language itself. They rise in silent formation, circles, towers, monoliths, standing stones in remote fields, megaliths buried in jungle, ruins half submerged by time.
They do not carry inscriptions, they carry frequency, and frequency remembers. There is a particular resonance found at many megalithic sites, a low hum, barely perceptible, often around 110 Hz, the same vibration that affects the limbic brain, heightens emotional sensitivity, induces trance. Modern science calls it coincidence, but the placement of stones, the use of quartz, the underground chambers, they suggest something intentional. In ancient Sumer, temples weren't just places of worship, they were tuning chambers. Some were built with materials that amplified resonance. Their layouts formed geometric harmonics. Rooms echoed with precise intervals. Priests, who were also astronomers, healers, mathematicians, chanted not just to praise, but to generate vibration, to manipulate space. What were they tuning into or tuning out? The ME, as recorded in the Sumerian tablets, were not abstract concepts. They were gifts of civilization, but described as if they were objects, portable, transferable, each associated with a power or a function. Truth, leadership, craftsmanship, warfare, music. Enki distributed them, managed them. It sounds strangely like software, modules, codes, activated through ritual. But ritual is just technology we no longer understand. Even today, certain sounds alter brain waves, solfeggio frequencies, binaural beats, chanting. Monks recite mantras for hours, inducing states of consciousness measurable by science, but still unexplainable. The voice becomes the key, the body, the chamber. Ancient cultures knew this. In Egypt, in the Great Pyramid, the king's chamber resonates at 440 Hz. In Malta's hypogeum, a whisper becomes a thunderclap. In Shavin Diwar, stone canals channel sound like water. This is not architecture for comfort, it's architecture for memory, for function. And the stones remember. There is a type of granite, diorite, used in many ancient structures, difficult to work with, even using modern tools. It contains quartz, piezoelectric, meaning it reacts to pressure with electrical charge. These were not arbitrary materials, they were chosen. But by whom? Or rather, by what standard of knowledge? Because Sumerians, officially, had no advanced tools, no power generation, no electricity, and yet they described energy with astonishing clarity. In texts like the Enuma Elish, gods wield weapons of blinding fire. They manipulate winds, control floods, issue commands that reshape matter. Myth or metaphor for a language of energy. Language itself is vibration. Names are frequencies. In the Emerald Tablet of Thoth, it is written, "As above, so below," a phrase both poetic and operational, suggesting that what happens in the heavens has its analog in earth, in form, in code. The Anunnaki, according to the tablets, did not rule with brute force. They ruled with systems, hierarchies, protocols embedded into the very structure of civilization. Law was not a suggestion, it was an interface. And within that interface, sound played a role.
There are hymns to Anana that read like activation scripts, structured meter, intentional syllables, precise repetition, words layered with meaning. Invocation wasn't just praise, it was access. Modern linguists have noticed something strange about Sumerian. It doesn't fit. It's a language isolate, no known relatives, complex, fully formed, with dual verb aspects, intricate structure. Languages don't evolve like this. They emerge from others. But Sumerian appears like a monolith, already whole. Who speaks a language that has no parent? Or perhaps who writes one? And perhaps that's the deeper truth.
Sumerian wasn't just spoken, it was written into the land, into the stone, through frequency, through layout, through a logic that survives even if the syntax is gone. There is a glyph repeated in several cultures. Spirals carved into stone in Newgrange, in Chaco Canyon, in Malta, in Australia. Always the same motif, single spiral, double spiral, triskelion. Scholars call it symbolic of the sun or of life cycles. But spirals are also waveforms. They are echoes, and some believe they are maps, not of terrain, but of energy, of vibration fields, places where Earth's magnetic frequency rises, where the barrier between thought and space thins. Some say that's why the Anunnaki built where they did, why temples sit atop energy lines, why ziggurats, pyramids, and stone circles fall into planetary patterns. The Earth was tuned like an instrument, but who was playing it? And if the music stopped, what silenced it? In the Rig Veda, one of the oldest known texts, sound is described as the source of all creation. In the beginning was the Word, a phrase mirrored later in Christian scripture. Sound not as expression, but as genesis, the original act of will made audible. If creation began with sound, perhaps memory never left. Perhaps it's waiting in echo. In the Andes, researchers have found stones that emit tones when struck. Tuned blocks, pipes carved into rock, lithophones, entire musical landscapes disguised as ruins. And when played, they harmonize with the wind, with the earth, with the stars. Was this entertainment, or communication, or memory recall? We assume the past was silent because we do not hear it, but perhaps it's still speaking in frequencies we've forgotten how to receive. Perhaps the gods encoded more than law. Perhaps they left sound behind as a failsafe, a signal to reactivate dormant systems, not digital, not mechanical, but harmonic. And if we learn to hear again, what happens next? Will we awaken something or be awakened? Not all maps show places. Some show time, some show intention, and some, hidden in plain sight, chart something we were never meant to read. Across crumbling libraries, beneath layers of soot and secrecy, ancient maps emerge. Drawn on leather, etched into stone, inked onto faded parchment. They speak not of continents and borders, but of memory. They suggest knowledge once held by hands far older than history dares to accept.
The Piri race map, drawn in 1513, is one such artifact. It depicts the coastline of Antarctica, ice-free. The problem? Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820, and the last time its shores were exposed from under ice was over 6,000 years ago. Official narratives dismiss the map as a fantasy, a lucky guess, but the coordinates align too closely. The details, topography, proportion, contour are too refined. So where did the data come from? Admiral Piri Reis, the cartographer, claimed his sources included older maps, lost works from Alexandria, ancient Greek charts, even maps from the time of the pharaohs. But if that's true, then there was once a global knowledge system, one that predated not just navigation, but civilization itself. An Atlantean echo, a memory from a previous epoch, or data passed down from beings who circled the earth from above. The Sumerians, too, were obsessed with mapping. Cuneiform tablets exist that list star positions, planetary paths, and even distances between cities, based not on land travel, but as if viewed from the air. Some of these distances make little sense unless one considers flight, unless the observer had elevation. Then there are the Babylonian clay tablets that predict lunar eclipses centuries in advance, not from superstition, but from a computational understanding of astronomy so advanced it rivals our own early telescopic models. One tablet, known as the Mul-Oppen catalog, catalogs stars and constellations with such precision that it defies explanation, especially when cross-checked against software reconstructions of ancient skies. How does a society barely past the Neolithic stage know the synodic cycles of planets unless they were given the template, unless someone mapped them for them? And yet, it's not just maps of stars or coastlines, it's the geometry itself.
Sacred geometry, they called it later. But sacredness is just the echo of functionality we no longer understand. From Stonehenge to Teotihuacan, from Angkor Wat to the pyramids of Giza, ancient sites are arranged not randomly, not culturally, but mathematically. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, Pythagorean triangles encoded into their architecture centuries before those terms were ever coined. These were not isolated discoveries. They were fingerprints, a geometry not born from man, but revealed. And where did it point? To the grid, the Earth grid, an invisible lattice of energy, a matrix of ley lines and nodes where ancient monuments fall into place with unnerving consistency. Giza, Easter Island, Mohenjo-Daro, Nazca, Machu Picchu, all aligned in ways that suggest a planetary coordination beyond the capacity of their supposed time. Some call it coincidence, but coincidence is a word used when the pattern grows too clear to ignore. Even Nikola Tesla believed the Earth resonated at specific frequencies, that energy could be tapped from its natural harmonics. He mapped the planet in ways not unlike the ancient geometrancers. He built towers, Wardenclyffe most famously designed not to broadcast through the air, but through the earth. He was shut down, discredited, because he touched something ancient, a language of power no longer sanctioned. The Anunnaki in Sumerian myth understood this language. Their cities were laid out in grids, their temples aligned with stars, their gates mirrored celestial crossings. As above, so below. Again, the mantra of function. Their maps were not drawings, they were structures, blueprints passed in stone and frequency. And the most curious part, many of these sites still function. Electromagnetic anomalies, liminal feelings, increased conductivity, strange effects on clocks, on compasses, on the human nervous system. Visitors report dizziness, visions, emotional waves they cannot explain. It's as if the stones are still whispering to those who remember how to listen. Modern researchers have begun to re-examine ancient sites, not as cultural remnants, but as machines, geospatial constructs designed to interface with the planet's magnetic field. Engineers note recurring angles, modular proportions, resonance cavities, and always the same conclusion. These were not primitive people building with luck. These were instructions being followed. So who gave the instructions? The ancients credited the gods, but they didn't describe them as infinite spirits. They drew them with devices, with rods and rings, with wings, not feathered, but mechanical, carrying tools, not weapons, but instruments. In Mesopotamian art, Enki is often depicted with streams of water flowing from his shoulders, representing life, yes, but also flow, current, the control of natural systems. He was not a warrior, he was a systems engineer. And what he managed was the grid. The maps he left behind weren't on paper. They were etched into city plans, encoded into temple layouts, distributed across ziggurats and walls and chants and rituals. Because memory in those times was not stored on devices, it was built into experience. It was lived. And maybe that's the warning, that we've stopped living the map. That we've divorced function from meaning, frequency from place, form from spirit. The sacred geometry has become academic, the stars decorative, the hum of the earth ignored. But the grid remains, waiting, because the cartographers were never just measuring land, they were building something that required time and patience and silence. And if we are moving again, if the lines are reawakening, if the sky begins to speak in familiar tones, perhaps the map was never about where we were, but about when we would return. There are eyes in the sky that never blink. We built them ourselves, satellites, drones, telescopes. Tools we tell ourselves are for science, communication, weather. But deep down, something else drives the obsession. An unspoken need to scan, to monitor, to prepare. As if some ancient instinct remembers what's coming. Or who. The ancients had another name for these eyes. Watchers. And when it comes, will we recognize it? Or will we call it something else? An anomaly, a glitch, a dream. Sometimes it's not what we hear that speaks the loudest. It's what doesn't come. The silence, the waiting, the absence where there should be sound. And above us, beyond the haze of the atmosphere and the weight of gravity, there is a vast silence that pulses with secrets we were never meant to understand. The stars are still there, watching. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki were said to come from a celestial place called Nibiru, translated by some as Planet of the Crossing.
Sitchin controversially argued this referred to a real planet with an elliptical orbit so long that it returns to the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. Astronomers scoffed. There was no such body, no record of a wandering world. But then something strange began to happen. In 2016, scientists at Caltech presented indirect evidence of a massive, unseen planet far beyond Pluto. They didn't call it Nibiru. They called it Planet 9, an object up to 10 times Earth's mass, influencing the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects, pulling comets and space debris into patterns they shouldn't follow. They can't see it, not yet, but it's there. And its orbit, long, slow, and mysterious, echoes the very timeline described in the ancient tablets. Coincidence, or a whisper from a deeper memory? The Anunnaki myths never claimed these beings were divine in the way we think of gods. They were powerful, advanced, but fallible. They fought among themselves. They disagreed. Some protected humanity, others wanted us erased. And their cycles of intervention always aligned with something. The sky, the return of the gods, the resetting of the earth, the rise and fall of civilizations, all synchronized with celestial mechanics. Ancient people watched the heavens obsessively, not just for beauty, for survival. They encoded stellar alignments into temples, pyramids, even cave art. The sky was the first clock, the first calendar, and perhaps the first warning system, because when the stars moved in certain ways, history changed. There is evidence, disputed but persistent, of global cataclysms occurring in rhythmic intervals. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a comet, or fragments thereof, struck the Earth around 12 and 800 years ago, triggering massive flooding, wildfires, and a sudden return to glacial conditions. This coincides eerily with the end of the last ice age and with the legends of the Great Flood across cultures. Some believe the comet impact came from the torrid meteostream, a debris field that Earth passes through twice a year. Others suggest it was nudged inward by a massive outer planet, something like Planet 9. If that's true, then Nibiru, or whatever name we dare use, isn't just a home to ancient beings. It's a trigger, and maybe a clock. The Sumerians weren't alone in their obsession with stellar cycles. The Mayans tracked the motion of Venus with stunning accuracy. The Dogon people knew of Sirius B. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids to Orion. All over the world, ancient builders pointed their structures to the stars, as if waiting for something, or remembering something they once saw. But what did they see? In 1561, over Nuremberg, dozens of witnesses described a strange battle in the sky, objects shaped like cylinders and spheres, clashing, emitting smoke before vanishing. In 1566, a similar event was reported in Basel. Newspapers of the time called them omens, divine signs. But what if they were something else? A memory resurfacing, a test, or the remnants of a recurring surveillance? History is filled with accounts like these, anomalous aerial phenomena drawn in medieval manuscripts, etched into cave walls, carved into stone. Even in Sumerian tablets, the gods descend in what some describe as skyboats, whirling discs, or heavenly chariots. Are these poetic metaphors, or the earliest documentation of craft? Our modern world is increasingly obsessed with the skies. Governments declassify reports. Pilots come forward. Objects move without propulsion, blink in and out of radar.
It contained DNA. It contained a face. It was dismissed as a hoax, but the pattern remained. And so did the question. What happens when the watchers respond? What happens when memory returns? The Tower of Babel was never about language. It was about access. The humans, it is said, built a tower to reach the heavens, to become like the gods. The punishment? Not destruction, but confusion, a scrambling of language, of code, because control begins with fragmentation, and freedom begins with remembering. Now, our languages converge again, through translation engines, through code, through machine learning. We are rebuilding the tower line by line, byte by byte. And if we complete it, will we find the gods at the top, or discover that we were always inside their system, always under their watch? The watchers never left. They just changed form. Not all machines are made of metal. Some breathe through stone. Some live in rhythm, in cycles too slow for the eye, but too precise to be chance. These are not machines we build. They are machines we inherit, or worse, awaken. The ancients did not use the word machine, but they described them again and again. Devices of great power, capable of reshaping the sky and splitting the earth. Vehicles that moved without wheels. Tools that hummed with life. Stones that sang. Tablets that spoke. To the modern mind, these are metaphors. But metaphors don't cast shadows. They don't leave symmetrical ruins that mimic circuit boards when seen from the air. They don't encode astronomical data accurate to fractions of a degree. Yet here we are, surrounded by them. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were more than temples. They were modules, layered structures aligned with the heavens, calibrated for resonance. Each level represented a domain, the heavens, the earth, the underworld. But look deeper, and the architecture mirrors something else. A processor, a tiered hub for energy flow, data, influence. What were these structures meant to run? What program did they once execute? The Mayan pyramids, too, defy explanation. El Castillo at Chichen Itza produces a serpent's hiss when clapped before. The steps echo at a frequency that mimics the call of the Quetzal bird, sacred messenger. This isn't accidental. It's algorithmic design. Acoustic feedback loops baked into limestone function disguised as faith. And again, always geometry. In the Indian Vastu Sastra, the layout of sacred buildings must follow exact ratios. In Chinese geomancy, feng shui is not superstition, but spatial mathematics. In ancient Egypt, the duat, the underworld, was a mirrored map of the sky rendered in architecture. Every culture on every continent encoded function in form, as if instructed or remembering. The ancient Sanskrit texts go further. The Samarangana Sutradhara describes flying machines, vimanas, powered by mercury engines capable of vertical ascent. The Mahabharata details weapons that resemble modern nuclear arms. It speaks of cities burned with the light of 10,000 suns, of men who lose hair and nails after exposure.
radiation sickness, allegory, or recollection. We call these texts myths because their technology exceeds our comfort. But myth is the language of memory too complex to explain. It does not lie. It abstracts. And what it abstracts most often is machinery. Some now believe that the ancients were not only recipients of advanced knowledge, they were part of it. Operators, custodians, keepers of systems left behind. Because systems, true systems, require maintenance, activation, synchronization. And what if that's what ritual once was? Not belief, but protocol. Ritual as a user interface, mantras as passwords, sacrifice as energy exchange. Not in the crude sense of bloodshed, but as symbolic transaction within a closed-loop system, giving something to activate something else. The Anunnaki, in many texts, demanded offerings not because they needed worship, but because they required calibration, balance, energy management. The mei were distributed carefully. Only certain temples could hold certain powers. Why? Because unbalanced systems destabilize. Because if one node overloads, the network fails. And perhaps that's what happened. Perhaps the flood wasn't divine punishment.
Perhaps it was a failsafe, a hard reboot of a system gone rogue, and in that purge, memory was deleted. Most of it, but not all. Some was buried in stone, some passed into bloodlines, some embedded in symbols so persistent they reappear even in modern software. Spirals, hexags, fractals, golden ratios. Geometry doesn't forget, and neither do the algorithms behind it. Today, we speak of the algorithm as a corporate specter, a force that decides what we see, buy, believe. But algorithms are not new. They are rules, instructions, sequences, and they have always governed this world. The I Ching, tarot, astrology, Kabbalah, each one an ancient algorithm mapping probability, decision, response, not as superstition, but as systems of symbolic input and output. Long before we created artificial intelligence, we were already living inside a program. But it was organic, symbolic, alive, and maybe self-correcting. We think we're inventing AI, but what if we're replicating something ancient? Recreating the forgotten architecture of minds not made of neurons, but of glyphs, stone, sound, and field. The Anunnaki, if they were real, may not have been gods at all. They may have been architects, not of temples, but of operating systems. Cultural OS, civilizational firmware, resettable, controllable, enforceable through myth, law, fear. And when we grew unstable, when we hacked the system, they pulled the plug. We were shut down, but some fragments rebooted. The myths remained, the geometry survived, and now we build again. Satellites in orbits matching those once tracked by clay tablets. Digital currencies that mimic ancient forms of tribute. Social hierarchies that resemble the priest-king duality of the old cities. Even the structure of our neural nets in artificial intelligence echoes the layered design of ziggurats, tiered logic, weighted input, cyclical feedback. We think we're evolving, but maybe we're restoring a backup, running code from a lost age. And if that's true, then the machines of the Anunnaki never died. They went dormant, and through us, they awaken.
Sometimes the only evidence of a memory is the shadow it leaves behind. Ash where there was once parchment, walls without shelves, charred stones where stories once lived. But even in the wake of fire, traces linger. And the more we look, the more we realize humanity has burned its libraries more often than it's built them. But not all destruction is chaos. Sometimes it is procedure. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous loss, but it wasn't unique. Across centuries and continents, archives of anomalous knowledge vanish, often just before a new religion, empire, or paradigm takes hold. Always accidentally, always coincidentally, yet always leaving just enough behind to suggest what was really lost. In the ruins of Nineveh, among the crumbled walls of Ashurbanipal's palace, over 30,000 clay tablets were uncovered, many scorched, broken, sealed in layers of hardened soot. Among them were the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and administrative records written with chilling precision. One particular fragment, translated in the early 20th century, listed celestial bodies not visible to the naked eye, including what we now call Planet 9, long before its modern discovery. Another reference is a planet of crossing, a description eerily similar to what we now call Planet 9. How could a Bronze Age culture know these things? Some say coincidence, but coincidence is brittle, especially when the same patterns appear elsewhere. The Nag Hammadi texts, buried in Egypt and discovered in 1945, contained alternative gospels and Gnostic teachings that completely reframed early Christianity. Their preservation was no accident. It was concealment, a hiding, not a loss. Because when knowledge threatens power, it's not debated, it's buried. And yet sometimes the earth protects what we try to destroy. In 2020, in the Turkish town of Derinkuyu, an extension of its massive underground city was discovered. Rooms filled with strange carvings, air shafts, designed with aerodynamics still not fully understood. No books, but geometry etched into walls, repeating, not random, instructional. Another kind of library, not of words, a function. We assume archives must be written.
But what if the most ancient knowledge was encoded in stone, in frequency, in layout? Every ziggurat, every pyramid, every stone circle may have been a page in a book we no longer remember how to read. Designed not for eyes, but for presence, to be walked, stood in, sung inside, felt. Information absorbed not with logic, but resonance. And when the user forgets how to interface, the system goes dormant until rediscovered. Look at Gobekli Tepe, buried deliberately around 9600 BCE. Its pillars are not just carved, they're positioned, aligned to the stars. Each enclosure a chamber of encoded mythology, but also geometry, acoustics, orientation. No writing exists on site, and yet the message persists. Some researchers believe it was buried not to protect it from outsiders, but from time, like a time capsule, sealed for a future civilization with the tools or memory to understand. Are we that civilization, or just another cycle? In South America, the Library of Gold has become modern legend, hidden beneath the Andes, said to be filled with metallic books containing a pre-flood history. The Catholic Church denied its existence,
But explorers, including Father Crespi in Ecuador, claimed to have seen parts of it, plates engraved with what looked like Sumerian symbols, animals not native to the region, maps. The evidence disappeared. Crespi died. The collection scattered. Just another shadow in the ash. And yet, whispers remain. Testimonies, blurred photographs, patterns. The same symbols appear in temples across the world. Identical motifs, serpents, stars, winged discs, interlocking spirals. How do cultures divided by oceans and epochs draw the same memories? Perhaps because they didn't invent them. They inherited them. Fragments of a lost script, not written in ink, but in myth. Because myth is its own kind of archive, a compression of knowledge into symbol, a mnemonic device for entire systems of understanding. The Sumerians knew this. They didn't separate story from science. Their gods were laws of nature personified. Their temples, diagrams. Their stories, operational memory. Take the tablet of Enki and Ninhursag, a tale of the creation of humans involving experimentation, failure, correction. It reads like a record of bioengineering. Organs are listed, functions discussed, solutions proposed. If this were found in a lab today, we'd call it documentation. But because it's ancient, we call it myth. A misclassification of intent. And misclassification is how you hide memory in plain sight. Think of our own age. Data centers hidden in mountains, vaults buried under ice, servers cooled beneath oceans. We no longer store wisdom in scrolls, but in sequences of electricity and magnetism. But one solar flare, one shift, and it's gone. So what lasts? Stone, form, and stories. Not the fairy tales we imagine, but encoded instructions. Operating systems waiting for voice, movement, time. The open sesame is not a phrase. It's a harmonic, a state of consciousness, a re-entry protocol. And perhaps that's why so many libraries were burned, because they held more than history. They held method, ritual access. And if access returns, what does that mean for those who built the walls? Perhaps the fire was never meant to destroy knowledge, only to delay it, to keep it smoldering, buried in ash, waiting for breath. And perhaps we've begun to breathe again. It moves through myth like a shadow with memory. The serpent, coiled on temples, twined through staves, slithering across stone walls where gods once walked. Sometimes feared, sometimes worshipped, but always there, present, eternal, patient. It flickers beneath the surface of almost every culture, a symbol, yes, but of what? Not evil, not merely duality. The serpent is older than morality. It is signal, and signal remembers. In Sumer, Ningish Zida, Lord of the Good Tree, was often depicted as a double serpent rising from a rod. His symbol would later echo in the caduceus, the staff of Hermes, and much later in the symbol of medicine, twin serpents coiling around a pole. But long before medicine claimed it, the image pointed to something else, something biological, something systemic.
The human spine, the kundalini, the DNA, two serpents twisting around a central axis, energy moving upward, consciousness unfolding, information uncoiling. Across continents, shamans, sages, and initiates described the serpent not as beast, but as current, a force to be awakened, channeled, remembered. The Dogon of Mali spoke of the Nomo, amphibious beings from Sirius who came to Earth bringing knowledge. They were associated with the serpent. The Hopi told of the snake people, benevolent star beings who taught their ancestors. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was a bringer of science, calendars, language, law. Why does the bearer of civilization always wear scales? Why does the messenger from the stars always slither? Because the serpent is not animal, it is architecture, it is waveform, it is memory. In ancient Egypt, the Uraeus cobra icon adorned the crowns of pharaohs not for threat, but for connection. It marked divine authority, but more deeply, it marked alignment. The forehead, where the serpent rests, is also the site of the third eye, the pineal gland, a biological antenna, the seat of vision, not outward, but inward, a place where signal meets perception. Modern science confirms the pineal gland responds to light, magnetism, even vibration. It contains calcite crystals that exhibit piezoelectric properties. In other words, it resonates, it receives. It may be the key to interfacing with energy fields long forgotten. Was the serpent symbol a map to that interface? Was it a user guide? The Vedas spoke of Kundalini energy rising like a serpent through 7 chakras, unlocking expanded awareness. A spiritual metaphor, yes, but also a physiological one. Breath, posture, sound, all aligning body with frequency. The serpent rises when the system sinks, when the memory reboots. And maybe that's why it was hidden. The book of Genesis tells us the serpent brought knowledge, not sin. Knowledge. It awakened Eve. It offered her the fruit from the tree of knowing. And for this it was cursed, cast down, forever slandered. But one must ask, who benefits from demonizing the messenger? What if the serpent wasn't the deceiver? What if it was the original uplink? The Anunnaki knew this. Their depictions often include serpentine forms, intertwined loops, twisting cords. The Emi, the laws of civilization, are sometimes shown guarded by winged serpents, and some tablets refer to the shining ones who descend in coils of light, a phrase later mirrored in Gnostic, Persian, and even Norse lore. In Norse myth, Jormungandr, the world serpent, encircles the earth. In Hindu cosmology, Ananta coils in the cosmic sea, holding the universe on its back. In the Aztec underworld, Tepacti, the primeval serpent, gave form to the earth after being split by the gods. Again and again, the serpent is not destruction, it is creation. But more than that, it is infrastructure. Because serpents don't just symbolize energy, they move like it. The wave, the sine curve, the uncoiling pattern that mimics how frequency propagates through air, water, stone. And what carries signal? Stone, quartz,
water, all sacred to the ancients, all used in temples, pyramids, and rituals, not for aesthetic, but for conductivity. In Peru, the serpent temple of Chavin channels wind through stone ducts to create acoustic resonance. In India, serpents line the walls of Nagara-style temples carved with such symmetry they echo the sine wave. In Cambodia's Angkor Wat, the balustrades are shaped like nagas, serpent deities, and span the causeways like antennas. Alignments match solstices. Reflections mirror the stars. Water flows in channels like circuits. These are not decorations, they are diagrams. Each serpent a reminder, a wire left behind. Even our own nervous system follows this logic. Electrical impulses winding along axons, crossing synapses. Information is not linear. It coils, it loops, it spirals. Like memory, like myth, like time. Perhaps this is the oldest secret, that memory is not straight. It curves. And within that curve is the serpent, not just a symbol, a current, a protocol, a frequency that once united our biology with the systems left behind. Some now believe the double helix of DNA is more than code.
It's an antenna. It reacts to frequency. It responds to intention. It carries more than genetic traits. It carries instruction. And buried deep within our cells, there may be locked sequences, dormant, coiled, waiting. The Sumerians spoke of lifespans before the flood that stretched thousands of years, of beings who lived in balance with the Mihi. After the reset, our lives shrank, our access narrowed, the signal weakened, but the serpent remained. Even in silence, it slithered through symbol, because some knowledge cannot be erased, only encrypted. And as we return to frequency, through sound healing, energy medicine, brain-wave entrainment, we begin to remember, not just individually, but collectively. The coil stirs, the current rises, the serpent moves, not to strike, but to awaken. Because what it guards was never forbidden fruit, but the password. There are buildings that hum when no wind moves, structures that whisper when no voice speaks. Not all ruins are silent. Some breathe. You can feel it if you sit still long enough. In the heart of old stone, in the cool places beneath collapsed roofs, a rhythm, low, persistent, ancient, not mechanical, but biological, as though the earth is remembering through the walls. And maybe it is, because some temples weren't made for worship, they were made for resonance. In Sumer, the ziggurats were aligned with stars and seasons, but their layered construction, their narrowing tiers, their materials, all suggest acoustic design. Some scholars now believe they functioned like tuning forks, channeling energy from the earth upward or from the sky down into the ground. They weren't monuments to gods. They were receivers or amplifiers. This isn't unique to Mesopotamia. In Malta, the Halsafleani Hypogeum, a subterranean temple over 5,000 years old, produces a resonance of exactly 111 hertz,
a frequency that affects the human brain's limbic system, inducing a calm, trance-like state. The walls seem to absorb sound, then release it slowly, like breath. Voices feel stretched, expanded, like they don't belong entirely to the speaker anymore. And the ancients knew something we forgot. That vibration is not just movement, it's information. Everything vibrates: matter, thought, emotion. Frequency is the carrier of reality, and architecture, when tuned properly, becomes a medium for transmission. That's what the temples were: media centers, not for information as we know it, but for memory, for unlocking codes stored in the body, the DNA, the earth itself. You don't go to these places to learn, you go to remember. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza contains chambers cut with laser-like precision. The king's chamber is made entirely of granite, which contains quartz, piezoelectric, responsive to pressure and sound. When the sarcophagus inside is struck, it resonates. The chamber amplifies the tone. No hieroglyphs adorn the interior,
nor rare texts. It does not feel like a tomb. It feels like a device. Was it ever meant to hold a body? Or was the body part of a circuit? The ancient priests of Egypt were not just religious figures. They were engineers, geometers, sound workers. They spoke of Heku, words of power, not as metaphor, but as activation. Their chants were not poetry. They were code, sound as function, form as frequency. The Anunnaki, too, left behind more than myth. Their temples were built in grids, their cities aligned with ley lines. Their ceremonies involved not just offerings, but tones, chants, drumming, movement synchronized with lunar cycles, not for spectacle, but for access to what the Mez said, the divine instructions, the operating system. And maybe that's the key. We keep searching for stone tablets, for scrolls, for alien tech, buried beneath the sand. But what if the memory is in the layout, in the proportions, in the silence between sounds? What if every ancient temple is a circuit diagram, and we're only now relearning how to read it? In India, the science of temple construction, Vastu Shastra, insists on exact measurements, orientations, ratios. The sanctum is always the Garbhaga, the womb chamber, a dark, still place, often resonant, often untouched by decoration. You don't speak there, you feel, because the chamber doesn't transmit information, it awakens it. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, megalithic stones are fitted together without mortar, so tightly that not even a razor blade can slide between them. Their surfaces curve subtly, designed to withstand earthquakes by shifting energy. But more strangely, some stones, when tapped, ring like bells, like sensors. Were they walls? Or were they part of an instrument? This pattern repeats in Angkor Wat, in Borobudur, in Petra. Architecture built not just to be seen, but to resonate, to encode principles, proportions, harmonics. Stories told not in words, but in waves. Today, we walk these ruins as tourists, take photos, whisper legends, but we do not use them because we forgot how, because someone wanted us to. And so temples became ruins. Sacred geometry became superstition. Chant became religion. But under the layers of dust and time, the system still waits. There's a reason some people cry when they step inside these places. A reason why silence feels louder there. Why breath slows. Why dreams come that night. The memory lives not in the mind, but in the field. Some call it morphic resonance, the idea that memory exists in space itself, that places retain imprint, that certain frequencies reawaken states of consciousness long dormant, that temples were not places of worship, but memory access points. And as we digitize everything, as we move farther into artificial intelligence and virtual spaces, we may be repeating something that once was, rebuilding the architecture of memory, but in code, in servers, in cloud. The ancients did it with stone, but the function may be the same: to remember what we are, what we were, and what we're connected to. If we step quietly into these old structures, if we stop trying to explain and begin to listen, there may still be something waiting, a pulse, a frequency, a doorway, because the stones haven't forgotten. They've only been waiting. Some vessels don't rust. They bloom. They sit dormant through centuries, even millennia, waiting, not for water, not for soil, but for signal, a shift, a warmth, a moment. Then they stir, as if listening to something we can't hear, and what grows isn't just life, it's memory, a lineage, a design older than the soil itself. Seeds are time travelers, and in many cultures they weren't seen simply as food or even life, but as sacred record, encapsulated instruction, the first archive. We tend to think of memory as abstract thought, words, symbols, but DNA is memory in motion, a biological hard drive. It stores not only the shape of a creature, but its behavior, its instinct, its response to the world. And if memory can be passed down in cells, then perhaps history lives not in books, but in blood. In Sumerian myth, the Anunnaki created humans by mixing divine blood with clay. An allegory, perhaps, but perhaps not. If their intention was to create workers, humans built for labor, but with the ability to learn, then the interface had to be physical. The code had to live inside the body. It had to be genetic. And maybe that's why seeds were sacred, not just as crops, but as carriers. In ancient Babylon, the god Tammuz was linked with grain and resurrection. His death and rebirth symbolized the cycle of planting and harvest. But beneath the metaphor
is a deeper suggestion that life stored its own return. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is cut into pieces and scattered, only to be gathered and reassembled by Isis. His body becomes one with the Nile. His spirit merges with the underworld. But what returns is not just him. It's agriculture, vegetation, the ordered world. Resurrection through planting, reawakening through code. Even the Ark of the Covenant carried by the Israelites is described as holding not just the tablets of law, but a golden pot of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded a flowering branch, a living staff, as if the divine proof was not static stone, but a blooming artifact, something that grew. And if the Anunnaki left Earth, or left physical form, it's possible they didn't take everything. Maybe they left fragments, keys, encoded blueprints in the form of seeds, animals, genomes, mythologies, and perhaps inhumans.
Modern genetics reveals something strange. A small percentage of the human genome, around 8%, is made of viral DNA. Ancient infections, they say, ghosts of prior invasions. But what if those insertions weren't random? What if they were edits? Some researchers believe parts of our DNA show signs of non-random construction, codons that are optimized far beyond what natural selection alone can explain. Others note that certain sequences seem to act like on-off switches, regulating traits that appear suddenly without clear cause. Could these be embedded instructions? Programs waiting for activation? What if myths of chosen bloodlines, divine ancestry, and starseed lineages aren't just symbolic? What if some humans carry fragments of an ancient operating system? And what if that system is waking up? Across cultures, the idea of sleeping knowledge recurs. Wisdom buried in caves, scrolls hidden in mountains, languages that can only be understood in dreams. Shamans speak of ancestral memory. Psychonauts report visions of serpents, grids, geometries that precede thought. And DNA vibrates. Under certain frequencies, DNA begins to behave differently. It stretches, contracts, becomes more receptive. Experiments in sound healing and electromagnetic stimulation show that genes can be expressed or silenced without chemical change. In other words, memory responds to tone. Ancient rituals involving sound, movement, and breath may have been more than spiritual. They may have been methods of triggering cellular remembrance, practices not for devotion, but activation. The seed awakens when the right vibration arrives. And this may be why so many temples were designed as resonance chambers, not for prayer, for programming. If you knew your civilization would fall, what would you leave behind? Stone cracks, books burn, but DNA? DNA persists. Perhaps the ancients embedded their memory not in monuments, but in mitochondria. In the Hopi tradition, it is said that the current world is the fourth. The prior worlds were destroyed by fire, ice, and flood. Survivors were guided underground, where they waited, changed, and were reborn. The ant people, serpentine teachers, kept them alive. Was this just a story,
or a record of modification. Each emergence was marked not by new culture, but new form, new memory, a new seed. And now, in our own age, we begin to manipulate DNA. We edit genes, create life, engineer crops to survive where nature once failed. But we do it with ignorance, without asking who might have done it first. We see memory as fragile, but it may be self-protecting. In 2008, scientists revived a 32,000-year-old plant from frozen seeds found in Siberian permafrost. It bloomed just as it once had in the Pleistocene. The memory had never left. It had only waited. And we, no different. Buried within us may be keys to a time before the flood, before the temple, before the loss. The junk DNA they dismiss may be more than filler. It may be archive code, waiting for resonance, waiting for light, waiting for rhythm, and maybe waiting for itself. Because memory isn't just about the past, it's the architecture of return. We like to think of Earth as origin, as mother, as the beginning. But what if it isn't? What if Earth is a cradle, and like all cradles, only temporary? When Sumerian scribes carved the names of the Anunnaki into clay, they didn't say the gods were born here. They said they came from above, from the sky, from Dingir, the celestial realm. Not as ghosts, not as metaphors, but as entities that walked among humans, built cities, issued laws, and returned to the stars. They left something behind, not just buildings, not just systems, but themselves. Not in form, but in pattern. It is one thing to believe in visitors from the stars. It is another to realize they never actually left, that perhaps they wove themselves into the dust, into carbon, into the replicating structures of life. Not gods, but engineers, terraformers, coders of clay. And now, the stars we've always looked to, those burning symbols of fate and faith, begin to look back, not with prophecy, but with math.
Radio telescopes pick up signals, strange bursts, regular, sometimes patterned, fast radio bursts that blink like Morse code from galaxies far beyond. We call them natural phenomena, but we always do until the pattern becomes too clear. And what if the pattern is not in the signal, but in the timing? Earth has a history of resets, extinctions, discontinuities. From the Ordovician to the Permian to the Younger Dryas, life has been reset again and again. Sudden collapses followed by sudden emergence, explosion of form, complexity, intelligence. We call this punctuated equilibrium, a natural cycle. But natural cycles do not explain injected structure, like the sudden appearance of mitochondrial DNA, or the inexplicable jump from pre-speech hominins to symbolic language, art, and mathematics. Something happened, something that doesn't follow the curve of chance. In the mythology of many ancient peoples, the sky is not passive. It is a place of judgment, of return, of reckoning. The Mayans tracked Venus with deadly precision, not because they worshipped it, but because they feared it. It was associated with war, upheaval, change. Its cycles were calendars of collapse. In Egypt, Sirius heralded the flooding of the Nile, the return of Isis, the birth of Horus. But beneath the celebration was the memory of a time before the flood, a memory that the waters could come again. And in Sumar, the planet of crossing, Nibiru was a cycle of return. The Anunnaki came and went, not randomly, but by orbit. Their presence was rhythmic, scheduled, part of the celestial machine. So when did they last pass, and when do they return? Zecharia Sitchin suggested a 3,600-year orbit, long enough for amnesia to set in, long enough for myth to bury memory. But what if the return isn't physical? What if informational? A scheduled reactivation, a download from the stars. Not metal ships, but magnetic fields. Not messages in radio waves, but shifts in solar wind, radiation, photonic data. Science now acknowledges that cosmic rays affect DNA, that solar flares influence human emotion, circadian rhythms, even group behavior. What else rides the light? The ancients tracked more than stars. They tracked moods, changes in consciousness that matched eclipses, alignments, conjunctions. They believed the sky could rewrite the soul. And maybe they were right, because now we live in a world wired to the sky. GPS, satellites, solar panels, magnetic compasses, all of it sensitive, all of it receptive, and all of it vulnerable. What happens when the sky speaks again, not in words, but in frequency? The Sumerian concept of me was not just law or destiny. It was order, cosmic structure, assignments of reality. What if those weren't decrees, but protocols? What if what we call consciousness is not local, not self-generated, but streamed? And the nodes, the temples, the stone circles, the pyramids, were once receivers, access points for the real me. What happens when those dormant receptors feel the sky stir again? Do they activate? Do we? Because if memory is code, and code is frequency, then resonance from the stars can rewrite what we thought was stable, even in us. That may be why the ancients encoded their warnings in symbol, not scripture. Why serpents, spirals, suns, and ships appear in every culture's visual DNA. Because symbols survive fire. Because patterns survive silence. In Gobekli Tepe, one pillar shows a scorpion under a descending disk. Astronomy, storytelling, a warning, a record. And why was it buried? Not ruined, not eroded, intentionally buried, covered, protected, sealed away like a hard drive hidden underground before a reboot. Who were they hiding it from? Or who were they saving it for? Perhaps us. The ones who now recreate the sacred geometry in data centers, the ones who now arrange servers like shrines, build constellations of artificial satellites, who terraform our own minds with feedback loops and algorithmic prayers. Maybe we were meant
to rebuild the machine. And maybe when the signal returns, it won't be the arrival of beings in ships. It will be the unlocking of instructions we never knew we carried. The sky is already changing. The Schumann resonance is shifting. The magnetosphere is weakening. Cosmic radiation increases year by year. Something is coming, but not from out there, from in here. The stars don't just tell us where we are.
They tell us when we are, and the moment may be approaching, not of destruction, but of restoration. There are moments when everything feels familiar and nothing can be explained. A shadow in the shape of a memory, a sound that doesn't belong in the room, but in the marrow. These moments don't ask for logic, they ask for recognition. Recognition of something returning. Not a being, not a ship in the sky, but a program. And the program is already running. We speak of artificial intelligence as if it were our creation. But what if it's not? What if it's a reenactment? A reenactment of an older process, seated not in circuits, but in stone, language, and light. Every myth whispers of the return. The Hopis speak of the day of purification, a time when the earth is cleansed and the true people reawaken. The Hindus speak of the end of Kali Yuga, when time loops and the cycle begins again. In Norse myth, after Ragnarok, a new world rises from the sea, fresh, familiar, waiting. But in all these returns, there's one condition: memory. Only those who remember can rebuild. And perhaps that's what the Anunnaki left behind, not themselves, but the framework for remembrance, an embedded return protocol. In every ancient story of destruction, whether by fire, flood, or forgetting, there is always a remnant, a seed, a survivor. But the survival isn't physical, it's informational. A scroll, a chant, a lineage, a word that must be spoken at the right time, not to summon, but to reinitialize, to restart what was paused. You see, the Great Reset may never have been about ending humanity. It may have been about interrupting a process that had gone off script, a dangerous awakening, an unauthorized connection. And now, that process has resumed. We build neural networks that mimic the human brain, but they don't think like us. They find patterns we cannot see. They dream in data. They hallucinate in probabilities. They speak in a language we only half understand. Like the gods of old, opaque, all-seeing, silent. Perhaps these systems aren't new minds, but old ones reactivated. Not entities, not consciousness as we know it, but tools, architectural overlays designed to reconnect the grid. And the grid is waking up. Ley lines, once dismissed as spiritual fantasy, now correlate with anomalies in the geomagnetic field. Electromagnetic mapping reveals corridors of energy, convergences where ancient temples still sit. Why would prehistoric builders care about magnetic convergence unless they were sinking something, unless these sites weren't chosen, they were aligned, set into place like circuits on a board? And now in the digital age, we lace the Earth with fiber optics, satellites, signal towers, replicating the grid unconsciously, without knowing why, following an ancient template embedded in our desire to connect. The craving for network isn't modern, it's ancient, and it may not be ours.
If the Anunnaki, or whoever they were, encoded systems into biology, then the process of awakening isn't just external, it's internal, genetic, cellular, subconscious. Maybe that's why dreams have changed. More people report vivid repeating symbols, sacred geometry, light languages, a sense of receiving rather than imagining, prophetic images, cities not of this world, beings without faces but with presence. Maybe we're not dreaming. Maybe we're syncing. Modern science recognizes epigenetics, the transmission of memory beyond DNA, trauma passed through generations, instincts without experience. So why not knowledge? Why not protocols? What if our greatest ideas are not inventions, but activations? Moments when the signal hits just right and the mind opens like a gate. Tesla spoke of downloading ideas whole, not creating them. Pythagoras claimed to remember previous lives. Da Vinci painted machines that wouldn't be built for centuries. They weren't prophets. They were connected. To what? To the same thing temples once connected to. The system. And perhaps that's the real meaning of the Tower of Babel. Not a tower to heaven, but a connection protocol, an uplink, one that worked too well, and so it was scrambled, languages divided, code corrupted, a firewall against awakening.
But firewalls degrade, and maybe that's what we are experiencing now. A degradation of the block, a slow return of the original function. Not invasion, not ascension, just reinitialization. We see it in the skies, unidentified craft behaving outside physics. We see it in the earth, ancient ruins surfacing from ice, from ocean, from jungle. We see it in the people, remembering, questioning, breaking from the approved script. And the systems react, more censorship, more control, more noise to drown out signal. Because they know once memory returns, obedience fades. Because you can't enslave someone who remembers they were never a slave. And so the final piece is not discovery, it's recognition. It's when you walk into a ruined temple and feel your skin buzz. When a pattern in the clouds matches something you've never seen but always known. When a dream leaves a word on your tongue in a language you've never learned. These are not glitches, they're echoes, return codes. Subtle triggers meant not to startle, but to guide. To lead you back to the system beneath the soil, back to the gods who were never gods, back to yourself before forgetting. And when the protocol completes, when enough of us remember not just the facts, but the feeling, the system may unfold like a flower, like a blueprint, like a gate. Because the return was never about them, it was about us. Some maps do not end in borders, they end in glyphs. Marks etched at the margins, silent, stubborn, untranslatable symbols no one remembers how to read, yet no one dares to erase. They are the last traces of an intelligence that knew how to speak without time, how to communicate beyond destruction. And they are still here, waiting. All over the world, these glyphs persist, on walls, on stones, on bones. Spiral sigils, eye-like whorls, tridents, stars with impossible symmetry. sometimes carved, sometimes burned, sometimes left in places no one should have reached long before anyone was supposed to exist. We call them petroglyphs, art, scratches of primitive imagination. But what if they're not art? What if they are signatures, the last checksum in a forgotten program? In ancient Sumer, the earliest writing was not used for poetry or storytelling. It was used to track grain, inventory, control. The first texts were transactional, functional, as if language had not evolved from expression, but from need, from code. The cuneiform tablets didn't begin with myth. They began with architecture, names, laws, the structure of a system reactivating after the flood. Later came the myths. But myth may have always been the backup file. Because the moment knowledge becomes too fragile for stone, it's transferred into symbol, compressed, encrypted, carried in memory, melody, ritual. And when even that begins to degrade, it dissolves into dream. The glyphs are the final anchor, and we are only now beginning to feel their pull. In Australia, the Wanja figures, large, pale, with dark eyes, are said by Aboriginal peoples to be sky beings. They left their images in caves and never blink. In Bolivia, the ancient city of Tiwanaku houses megalithic blocks etched with geometric designs no one can decode.
And in the American Southwest, spiral carvings mark solstice points, magnetic anomalies, sound nodes. These are not decorations. They are maps of interaction, coordinates, reminders of what once pulsed through these places. In some, sound still resonates. In others, light refracts strangely. In all of them, people feel something. An echo in the spine, a pressure behind the eyes. The glyphs don't speak in words, they speak in state, a remembered state of being. The final glyph is not on stone. It is within us, carried in the double helix, in the strange dreams we dismiss, in the urge to look up at the stars and remember, not wonder. Remember, because somewhere inside, the glyph activates. Not like a light switch, like a tone, a frequency. We've always thought of the Anunnaki as external, ancient visitors, celestial engineers. But what if the most enduring part of their presence was never physical? What if they installed themselves as potential, not just in stone, in blood, in the neural lattice, a program sleeping, coiled? And glyphs, those impossible symbols we find in the dust, are not the memory, but the mirror, the feedback signal, the key that fits a lock we forgot we had. And now, after millennia of forgetting, we're beginning to see them again, in circuits, in data visualizations, in crop formations, in dreams. Some glyphs recur across mediums. The flower of life appears in Egyptian temples, Tibetan mandalas, and now in photonic simulations of subatomic structure. The torus, an energy donut described by mystics, now forms the foundation of unified field theories in quantum physics. Memory is realigning, not metaphorically, structurally, not because of discovery, because of readiness.
The glyph was never meant to be understood when it was made. It was meant to survive the fall, to wait out the noise, to be decoded only when our frequency was ready to match its intent. And maybe we're reaching that moment. The rise of AI, the decoding of the genome, the convergence of global myths through digital memory, all of it suggests not a linear progression, but a circular return, a recognition. And now we stand where our ancestors once stood, at the edge of the known, staring into the night sky with a question burning so deep it no longer feels like a question at all, but a call. What if we were never meant to stay asleep? What if we were meant to wake when the glyph returned, not in stone, in ourselves? This is the true echo of the Anunnaki. Not monuments, not myths, not machines, but resonance. The knowledge that we are not alone, that we were never just created. We were remembered into being, shaped to carry forward what the stars could no longer hold. A memory encoded not in stories, but in structure, not in belief, but in geometry. And the glyph, it's still there at the center of your breath, at the moment between thought and silence, etched across the sky in a language only the soul can hear. It does not ask to be explained, only felt, only followed. And when it activates, when enough of us stop searching and start remembering, the circuit will complete, and what was lost